Every revolution swears it kills the old order. France did it with guillotines, a new calendar, and the promise of a new moral universe. They even tried to reinvent money. But when the smoke thinned and the crowds drifted home, the state still had to pay soldiers, pave roads, provision courts, and tame markets that obeyed panic faster than proclamations. One man understood that you can't govern chaos with slogans. You govern it with settlement. You govern it with credit. You govern it with a bank. Not just any bank, the Banque de France. Here says the paradox. The general who rose by smashing crowns perfected the most enduring instrument of kingship, centralized control of money. And 2 centuries after his cannons fell silent, the architecture he set in motion still decides who breathes easily in a crisis, and who learns how sharp the air can be when credit is cut. You can read the French Revolution as a pamphlet war, or as a currency crisis with speeches attached. The old regime kept order with privilege and the pretense of gold. Then came the paper miracles. First there was John Law, a Scotsman with all the audacity of a new century, who convinced a desperate monarchy that paper backed by promise could do what metal never could. For a time it worked. Trade surged, shares soared, then promises multiplied faster than trust. The Mississippi dream turned to mud, and confidence collapsed under the weight of its own echo. The public learned a cruel lesson. Paper is only as honest as the institution that defends it. The revolutionaries tried a different robe for the same ritual. Assignats, notes blessed by confiscated church lands, were proclaimed the people's money. In theory, they were backed by stone and soil. In practice, they were backed by need and fear. The printing plates ate through credibility faster than politics could replace it. Markets went black. Prices sprinted. Contracts melted. By the time Napoleon stepped from the smoke and into power, France had tasted both flavors of monetary failure, aristocratic alchemy, and revolutionary improvisation. The pendulum had shattered trust at both extremes. Absolute control without credibility and democratic idealism without discipline. What Napoleon understood was brutal and simple. Trust is not a speech. Trust is a custodian. It must be powerful enough to enforce belief and constrained enough to preserve it. So he built an institution that could play both parts with a straight face. In 1800, the Banque de France opened its doors as a curious creature. Privately owned, publicly crowned, charged with stabilizing payments in Paris, the heart where commerce and politics shared a pulse. It would discount bills, issue notes, and, when necessary, discover liquidity the way a general discovers reserves, just in time and without apology. To the public, this looked like prudence. To the state, it was a switchboard. If the Treasury needed advance on taxes not yet collected, the bank could whisper to the machinery of settlement and turn tomorrow, S-money into today, a West payroll. If a panic crept across the bill market, the bank could ration courage through a discount window that favored productive borrowers over speculative gamblers. Elastic in one direction, rigid in the other. That is not hypocrisy, that is design. Napoleon's bank was not an ornament to the state, it was the hinge that let the door of government swing without tearing off its frame. But a bank alone is not enough. You also need a money that courts will recognize, tax collectors will accept, soldiers will carry, and merchants will trust when the harvest fails, and rumors move faster than wagons. In 1803, Napoleon minted that credibility into law with the franc germinal. It was a metallic standard on paper, a legal standard in practice. Metal gave the story weight, the bank gave the story continuity, the law gave the story teeth. A wage meant something again, a contract regained a backbone, taxes took on predictable shape. Shopkeepers could read the future far enough to stock shelves and promise prices. A nation that had been arguing about how to measure value suddenly had a ruler and a scribe to keep the ledger legible. From there, the strategy sharpened. Control the price and availability of credit, and you control more than markets. You control politics. The Banque de France became a clearinghouse for confidence as much as for paper. Discount rates were a language. When they fell, the bank was telling commerce to breathe. When they rose, it was warning that breath had gotten greedy. Branches were not just offices, they were outposts of sovereignty. Through them, the state could extend a steady hand to strategic industries and a cool eye to gamblers who mistook momentum for law. This quiet battlefield doesn't win parades, but it wins regimes time. A government can survive a lost skirmish. It cannot survive a seized payment system. Napoleon understood that if you run the plumbing of commerce through a single, disciplined institution, you can standardize the rules, centralize the flows, and socialize the cost of fear. When crises hit, the bank's balance sheet becomes a sponge for panic. Ordinary banks retreat. The central bank advances. It widens collateral standards, discounts paper that yesterday would have been refused, and manufactures the only commodity that outpaces rumor: settlement on demand. But miracles require costumes. The most convincing one was independence. The bank would appear insulated from politics to reassure creditors, yet cooperate intimately with the state to serve the regime. Directors would speak in the grammar of prudence. Ministers would whisper the priorities of necessity. Convertibility would stand tall until standing tall threatened stability, at which point principle would be reinvented as policy. Rules would govern issuance until rules asked for interpretation, and interpretation just happened to align with the urgent needs of the Treasury. This isn't a scandal. It's the choreography of modern power. Markets like rules. Governments need flexibility. Independence becomes credibility theater. You hold hearings, you publish reports, you codify targets, and then when the storm comes, you widen the corridor, you dim the lights, and you do what is required to keep the promises that keep the state alive. The theater is not empty ritual. It is the stage on which confidence performs. Without it, credit is gossip. With it, credit is a habit, and habits write history. Did Napoleon invent central banking? London would protest. The Bank of England had been nursing the British state since the 1690s. But Napoleon weaponized its administrative potential and stitched it into a comprehensive system. Standardized codes, uniform courts, disciplined tax collection, and a bank that turned those inputs into liquid sovereignty. The template traveled. Throughout the 19th century, states across Europe normalized the idea of a singular keeper of money. Note monopolies took shape. Discount windows became routine. The lender of last resort, first a desperate improvisation, hardened into doctrine. By the time the 20th century taught its brutal lessons, the skeleton was everywhere. In Berlin, Rome, Tokyo, and eventually Washington, the same anatomy appeared. Legal privilege, market ritual, political purpose. Gold anchors came and went. War bonds rose and matured into welfare states. Reconstruction after catastrophe required the same instrument, an institution elastic enough to catch falling banks and rigid enough to promise that money would be money tomorrow. The Napoleonic contribution was not that he built a building in Paris. It was that he refined a choreography. The bank declares prudence, the state declares necessity, and between them the economy keeps moving even when the map is on fire. You see the real design in storms. In calm times, central bankers speak like engineers, marginal adjustments, basis points, corridor systems, measured steps towards stability. In panic, they speak like generals, surge lines, hold the flank, accept casualties in the periphery to protect the core. And the move is always the same. Losses are contained by institutions, gains are dispersed to markets. That's not an accident. It is insurance built into the architecture. The public balance sheet becomes the sink for fear. Private balance sheets become the staging grounds for recovery. The public rations stability so the private can rediscover appetite. Who decides when to flip that switch? Not voters at a ballot box, not parliaments in full televised debate. A committee, meeting behind a door thick enough to keep out television and panic, using models the public doesn't read and instruments the public can't vote on. You may call this technocracy. Napoleon would have called it administration. It is the same instinct dressed for a different century. When the essential task is to keep the machine running, you put the throttle in the hands of the few who know what each lever does and are willing to accept that some choices cannot be explained before they must be made. There is a cost. Government debt inside this architecture is not meant to be repaid in the sense of reaching zero. It is designed to be perpetual in practice, rolled like a wheel. Old bonds mature, new bonds replace them. The promise is serviced, not settled. For that to work, the system needs a reliable buyer of last resort and a trustworthy manager of interest rates. The central bank does both. The most reliable assets in the world become the promises of the state. The most reliable managers of those promises become the arbiters of normal. Who benefits from reliability? Those who hold the most paper, who can lock in financing at the right moment, who can trade fear for assets when prices dislocate. Who pays most predictably? Those whose taxes are certain and whose wages can be managed with the same patience used to explain inflation. This is not a morality play scripted with villains and saints. It is a mechanism with winners that compound and losers who float. The regime gets fiscal breathing room. Markets get assets to hold. The bank gets discretion to tune the pain. Over decades, the pattern is familiar. Asset holders ratchet upward in good years and are cushioned in bad years. Non-asset holders surf the waves, collecting spray. Napoleon did not design that social outcome. He designed the machine that makes it hard to avoid. Translate the old blueprint into modern language. Price stability. Targets are the dictionary of credibility. Quantitative easing is balance sheet elasticity with a new name. Macroprudential policy is the formalization of rationed credit with social aims baked in. The ancient tension hums beneath the acronyms. The bank must be close enough to the state to save it and distant enough from the state to reassure investors. So we ritualize independence. We hold press conferences where every comma is weighed like bullion. We issue forward guidance so that expectations can be herded without a shot fired. This is narrative control without the stink of propaganda. It is the art of making stability feel ordinary. The most Napoleonic move of all is the redefinition of normal. A few sentences from the central bank can lift markets by trillions or tighten credit in days. The words are not spells. The institution is the spell. Once the custodian of belief speaks, balance sheets reorganize themselves to match the new map of expected tomorrow. And that, more than cavalry charges or codes of law, is how modern states conquer the future. They define it first, then finance it, then tell you it was always the natural course. Of course, every architecture has a stress limit. For this one, the limit is confidence. The belief that the bank can be elastic without losing its promise of stability, that markets will keep treating government debt as savings instead of risk, that money will remain memory rather than rumor. What happens when inflation bites too hard and refuses to spit the taste back out? What happens when politics gridlock so long that budgets become theater rather than law? What happens when demographic tides and debt loads ask too much of tomorrow's taxpayers? The playbook does not change because the century does. Tighten here, extend there. Draw circles around what must be saved. Let the periphery discover discipline the hard way. Make exceptions without admitting that you made them. Manufacture consensus with models and phrases that sound like physics. It works until it doesn't. The line between prudence and improvisation is thinner than speeches suggest. When trust phrase, the institution leans on its two oldest assets: monopoly over the legal definition of money and partnership with the state's power to tax. You can change a lot in a hurry when you hold those two keys. If you want the whole picture, stand at three distances. Up close, you see clerks tallying bills, lawyers drafting charters, committees nudging rates. That is the craft. Mid-range, you see a choreography. The Treasury breathing with the central bank, the courts protecting the grammar of contract, the public accepting that money is whatever the law says and the bank clears. That is the system. Far away, you see a silhouette Napoleon would recognize, a sovereign who governs by defining the measurements of value and the timing of payment. That is power. Ask a final question and let it hang in the air. If the blueprint is so powerful, why did the man who used it lose? Because armies and finance are separate domains with overlapping but not identical laws. He mastered the operating system of the state and then bet the machine on a field where mud, distance, and fortune outrank genius. The model survived because the model embedded itself in institutions sturdy enough to outlast the hands that arranged them. The banks kept clearing, the courts kept stamping, the taxes kept flowing. Regimes rise and fall, the plumbing endures. There is a strange comfort in that, and a warning. The comfort is that we are not hostage to every gust of hysteria. We have institutions built to absorb shock. The warning is that we have trained ourselves to mistake institutional endurance for moral certainty. We forget how recent this architecture is, and how contingent it remains. We forget that money is not metal or paper. It is a story enforced by institutions. When enforcement wobbles, the story can rewrite itself overnight. History does not keep a ledger of promises redeemed. It keeps a ledger of systems that learned how to make promises believable longer than their rivals could. So when you hear leaders debate independence or discipline, remember the structure under the words. It is elastic in emergencies and rigid for discipline. It is public enough to save the state and private enough to calm the market. It socializes fear and privatizes recovery. It defines normal and then declares deviations to be temporary, even when they sprawl across years. It can't control the weather, but it can command credit. In the world we inhabit, that is usually enough. Usually, until confidence breaks. Then you learn again what governments have always tried to forget. Debt is not just arithmetic. It is faith with coupons attached. Money is not just a unit. It is memory curated by law. The state is not just a map. It is the network of pipes that make trade feel like nature. And the central bank is the citadel where these truths are kept, revised, and, if necessary, reinvented. It is the quiet monument to a lesson Napoleon learned while others were learning the weight of cannon. If you control settlement, you control time. If you control time, you control choice. The armies are gone. The architecture remains. It moves under our feet like a stage that seems to be a floor. And if the blueprint ever cracks, if trust snaps the way a flag does in too strong a wind, we will discover again what money really is. A story sturdy enough to outlast storms, only because someone has the authority to decide where the shelter is. That is the gift and the danger of the model. It made modern prosperity possible. It also made modern dependence inevitable. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers.